Chapter 8. The breeze rustled the remaining leaves on the trees. They weren't on the road, but were paralleling it from about 20 yards away, using the forest as cover. They had promised to keep their lips sealed about the dwarven passages under Dulangar, but Dare assumed a few other humans must know too. "I hope you're not planning on wearing that to meet the Count," Caleb said. Dare looked up from picking at the dwarven glue bandage. "What?" She stopped walking. He hesitated. "Well, besides all the bloodstains, they're a little ripped." She started picking at her tunic instead. "But they're the only clothes I have." She leaned on the crude walking staff they had cut for her. Caleb wore her backpack, but she had refused to relinquish her sword, even to the point of using it on them if they tried to take it away from her again. Kelin bunched his hands over some stains on his tunic. "We could probably buy some." "No," Dare grunted. "Our money needs to last." "Dare," Caleb frowned. "We need to make a good impression. It may be the only time in your life you do something like this." "That may have been the only time we get to meet dwarves, too," Kelin chimed. "But that was amazing. And those tunnels?" Caleb sighed. "It certainly came in handy for us. However, Dare still can't wear that to meet the Count. Trust me. Please." "Why not?" she demanded. "We can wash them first." Caleb raised both eyebrows. "Put it like this. If you removed every stain, you'd be out of clothes." Kelin blew out a sigh. "I've dealt with this before. Dare, do you remember when you went to visit your brother? You hadn't washed your clothes after the pig fiasco and the guard wouldn't let you in?" "Pig fiasco?" Caleb echoed. "My clothes were still decent, just a little dirty." She coughed and tried to recover her breath while leaning on the staff. "Right," Kelin agreed, after she finished wheezing. "And the same thing will happen here, only your brother will not be around to save you from being tossed into a cell." Caleb looked quizzical. "What happened?" Dare shrugged. "I kicked the guard in the knee and went in anyway." "What? It wasn't like I was invading the manor by myself." Kelin cocked a half grin and glanced at Caleb. "I've tried to explain this, honestly." He nodded. "I think I understand. What happened with the pigs?" Kelin chuckled. "The pigs had taken up position in—" An arrow kicked up the dirt inches from his foot. Dare stared at it. They all did for an endless second. She swallowed and tried to force herself to believe that the arrow really was there. Caleb shoved her. "Run!" 5 marauders leaped out from the foliage ahead of them. Dare stumbled forward, trying to draw her sword and sort out her feet. She felt the wind from another arrow tug at her hair. She gasped, and her vision exploded in bright colors as she tried to yank out her sword. Her eyes drifted up in her head, and she fainted. "Dare!" Kelin hollered. He gaped. The woman from the castle was rushing toward him, bow in hand, but he couldn't linger on her. All of them had swords, and their eyes burned with a deranged fire and determination. Caleb ripped off the backpack and rolled it in front of her head as he slipped his sword free with his other hand. An arrow punctured the pack and stopped, missing her by inches. "Kelin, move!" "But Dare!" he yelled. "Kelin!" He sidestepped to avoid staying in the same spot, and another arrow flew past him. "This is the only way! Now run!" He charged the archer. Caleb dodged the next arrow by moving just as the woman released her hand. She was fast and was already knocking another shaft. He sprinted as hard as he could. He yelled and jumped just as she leveled the bow at his chest. Sunlight glistened on the arrowhead's barbed point as he raised his sword. His blade struck home through the cheap leather armor. The bow sagged in her slackening hands. For Kelin, the distance between him and the attackers seemed impossibly far. He was not certain he was going to make it, or even if he wanted to, but the image of Dare passing out made him sprint faster. He brought up his sword in one hand and his hammer in the other. Nearby, Caleb kicked to his side as a man tried to flank him. His foot landed squarely on his face, and he caught sight of a double-headed snake pendant wrapped around his arm. The cultist swung his blade with all his weight behind it, but only cut through air. Caleb had dropped to a knee, and he thrust his sword into his attacker's gut. Kelin had finally closed the distance. He bowled over the nearest cultist, cutting him open as the man reeled backward, the cultist's sword whistling through the air. A few feet away, Caleb's blade fiercely clashed against the fourth attacker's blade. The cultist's sword flicked across his shoulder. Caleb hissed, but managed not to drop his sword's point. He retreated a few steps, and the man rushed forward into the opening space. Caleb parried a few times and then feinted high. The man tried to parry it and exposed his hip. Caleb didn't miss. The last assailant rose up behind him. Kelin hurled his hammer. The handle bounced off the man's cheek, but it stunned him long enough for Caleb to thrust his sword home. It was over in the same amount of time it had taken Kelin to close the distance. He leaned forward, trying to recover his breath. Then he stared at his new friend. Caleb had been so fast. Kelin thought he had missed half the fight when he'd blinked. "Where, in the corners of hell, did you learn to do that?" Caleb sheathed his sword and pointed with his free hand. "Get there!" He spun on a heel and dashed into the trees. Kelin heard anxious whinnies and stamping hooves. 3 saddled horses burst out of the forest. Caleb emerged, leading 2 others, even as they fought against his pull. "Are those their horses? Have to be, right? Get there!" He jammed his foot in a stirrup and swung up into the saddle. Kelin hesitated, staring at the wild-eyed horse in front of him. It was so much bigger than the ponies he was used to. He passed the backpack up to Caleb. Then he turned to his horse, rolled Dare up by the pommel, and pulled himself onto the saddle. It felt cramped and awkward. Caleb wheeled the horse toward the highway and kicked its flanks. Kelin grappled with the reins as his own mount broke into a canter, its hooves pounding against the mud and grass as they flew down the road.